Early this afternoon, crews working on the SLS, the Space Launch System, put the rocket into its final flight configuration. This critical test of brand new hardware could put people on the moon again for the first time in more than 50 years. Calm, just days before the launch of the most powerful rocket to ever take flight from the U.S. The Space Launch System, or SLS, will carry the Orion space capsule to the moon, ushering this generation's moonshot, known as Artemis. This launch, Artemis 1, will be an uncrewed flight but will test all the systems, setting the stage for astronauts to ride on Artemis 2. This project started a decade ago. Each launch will cost an estimated $4.1 billion. University of Iowa professor Casey DeRue says it's a financial benefit that can pay for itself based on previous investments.
The basic functions of our day-to-day life are directly born out of technologies that were developed as a part of our nation's investment in space exploration.
Head south towards Saturn Causeway.
Modern technology like GPS, the internet, satellite communication, and even medical advancements like easier treatment for dialysis all stem from the Apollo era. This 21st century moon rocket uses tested hardware like the engine from the space shuttle, but the rocket configuration is entirely new.
There's a lot of history that's built into this, so it's a maturation, it's a system that's matured over time, but far more capable. It's designed to go to the moon and Mars and beyond.
Tony Byers is the deputy program manager of Orion at contractor Lockheed Martin. While the rocket is new, the capsule that astronauts will ride in has been tested before.
And liftoff.
In 2014, the spacecraft took a ride into low Earth orbit on a test flight. This launch, though, will test Orion in whole new ways.
So it is a different system test, but it's still a system test. So there's a lot of new things that are on the spacecraft that wasn't on the 2014 test. As far as jitters, it's anytime you've got a full up system test and everything's integrated for the first time, there's always that excitement and that nervousness.
On a stormy Saturday at the Kennedy Space Center, launch teams took their positions and the Artemis 1 mission entered the formal countdown. Forecasters currently predict a 70% chance of favorable weather for launch on Monday, and everything is looking good for the maiden flight of the Space Launch System rocket.
As of right now, the rocket is in fantastic shape. Obviously, we're checking everything to make sure that there aren't any issues, but as of right now, we're ready for this launch. Everything's looking good.
While the launch remains on track Monday, the project has seen delays over the years. The first SLS was supposed to fly in 2017. 5 years later, NASA is finally go for launch. This project has gone through 3 presidential administrations. It's had some setbacks along the way. At any point, did you feel like this day wouldn't come?
I've always been confident that we would get to this day. Anytime you build the most powerful rocket and you have an engineering marvel like we have sitting on the pad today, there are going to be things that you have to solve and things, we've had hurricanes and we've had a global pandemic to go through, but I never really questioned the fact that we would get to this point and this team would pull together and have us ready to launch.
If the United States is committed to reaching the moon this decade, the country needs a rocket like SLS, the most powerful rocket to ever be built. This launcher is currently the only one that is ready to fly humans that far.
At liftoff, this vehicle is going to provide 8.8 million pounds of thrust, which is unheard of. It's a first of its kind, and we're going to need that much oomph, if you will, at liftoff in order to get the Orion, which is about 27 metric tons in weight, to the moon.
Orion is the space capsule at the very top of the rocket, the first launch, paving the way for astronauts to soon step foot on the surface of the moon again, happens on Monday, August 29th, liftoff set for 8:33 Eastern Time. At the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, I'm meteorologist Nick Stewart reporting.
First NASA rocket in a decade is scheduled to take off to the moon, paving the way for humans to return following a 5-decade lapse. Weather First meteorologist Nick Stewart is live at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida after talking one-on-one with one of the astronauts that may soon be riding the next rocket to the moon.
And it's a decade in the making, but now Just hours from reality for an astronaut who may soon ride on one of the future Artemis missions. Stepping foot on the lunar surface, that's far from the most important part of Artemis.
And this was built by humans, and those folks have been working on this for a really long time, and I'm looking forward to celebrating their hard work.
In the final hours ahead of the Artemis 1 mission, final steps are being conducted ahead of the fueling of 733,000 gallons of rocket propellant as the Space Launch System is poised to take flight for the first time. NASA astronaut Victor Glover says the importance of the mission should not be understated and that everything we have done in human spaceflight leads to Monday's launch.
This is a relay race, and Mercury handed the stick off to Gemini, handed it off to Apollo, handed it off to Apollo-Soyuz, handed off to Shuttle, handed off to the ISS. And then there was kind of a medley relay with the ISS and commercial crew and flying with our partners like SpaceX and Boeing. And all of that is fed into this.
Aside from testing the launch vehicle and the Orion space capsule that astronauts will ride in future launches,
It looks like clothing, but this is actually like a system here.
the survival suit that astronauts like Glover may wear in future missions is also being tested to see how it can withstand the harsh space environment. A 21st century suit that has come a long way since the last moon trip 5 decades ago.
The basic idea of it's the same, right? It's a pressure suit. It has 3 different layers in it to provide them what they need for thermal protection, for abrasion protection.
Glover says inspiring a new generation of children and adults alike to reach for the moon is one of the greatest benefits of this project.
That's not the most powerful rocket ever. After it flies, it will be. And our generation doesn't have our own moonshots, but after it lands successfully, we will. We talk about Apollo and talk about any great things humans do, we call it moonshots, but we're always referring to Apollo. We make this successful, and now our generation gets to say we have a moonshot as well.
And fueling of the SLS rocket, which is lit up beautifully tonight behind me, is expected to occur in about 90 minutes or so. Liftoff is currently scheduled for tomorrow morning at 7:33 a.m. Central Time. Live at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, I'm Weather First Meteorologist Nick Stewart, Iowa's News Now. The Artemis 1 launch, it's of course grabbing a lot of attention due to the eventual future missions which will put astronauts back on the surface of the moon. But the science part of Artemis is just as big. I talked to a University of Iowa professor and researcher who hopes to someday use this rocket for one of his own missions.
That I hope to be able to propose missions to do and to be able to leverage those technologies that are being developed today.
University of Iowa Professor Casey DeRue is excited about the new capabilities a rocket like SLS provide and the benefit to the scientific community.
So that mirror...
DeRue was recently awarded more than $250,000 from NASA to develop technology, creating mirrors so thin the shape can be controlled remotely. An aspiration is to someday build a miniaturized space telescope using this technology in the size of a shoebox, known as a CubeSat.
Previous satellite.
Right now, CubeSats are typically deployed close to Earth.
And 1, 2, 3, go.
In some cases, quite literally being thrown from the International Space Station. The Artemis mission can send these CubeSats much farther away to the moon and beyond.
How we might use these incredible platforms to do the science of tomorrow. And so, as an example, the Artemis capability is deploying CubeSats. That's going to be able to deploy up to 17 CubeSats in a single launch, which is an incredible return, in addition to having a manned lunar mission.
This optic right here,
while entities outside of NASA are excited to propose missions using Artemis as a backbone, the chief scientist at NASA is already leveraging the mission ready for launch to conduct scientific experiments.
So we have CubeSats on there. Some are going to help us understand radiation. Some is going to help us better understand the moon. We have one that's going to go look at an asteroid. So lots of fun science coming with those CubeSats.
For future great discoveries at a lower cost, the SLS must perform its job. The most powerful rocket in the world can usher in a great new era of scientific discovery.
Mass is king, right? It takes a rocket a lot of effort to be able to deliver large amounts of material into space. The SLS is going to give us an unprecedented ability to be able to actually deliver mass to these locations.
And that launch again is set for 1:17 Central Time on Saturday afternoon. If for whatever reason the launch gets scrubbed again, the next attempt would be next Monday.
And hopefully this is the time it goes. Weather First meteorologist Nick Stewart tracking that. Nick, at the top of the hour we talked about hydrogen situation, and there was a crew on its way there, some bolts to tighten, something. It's always something like that, right? Any updates there? It sounded like that was going to be a 15-minute job, and maybe they were just arriving on the launch pad not too long ago.
Yeah, they should be finishing up here in the short term. We should get an update on that here shortly. What we do know is that that issue that they're resolving right now at the pad where they're having to tighten those bolts, it may eat into the launch window. It is a 2-hour window, goes from 12:04 to 2:04 a.m. Central Time. We want to keep you up to there. If that clock hits zero tonight, though, let's talk a little bit more about what Artemis will be doing and the rocket will be doing in the following few minutes. So, at about 6 seconds prior to liftoff, the 4 main engines at the bottom of the rocket will ignite. Those RS-25 engines will ignite. Then, once we reach that T0 mark, that's when those 2 white towers, those solid rocket boosters, that is when they will ignite as well. That's when 8.8 million pounds of thrust will push Artemis into low Earth orbit to start things off. At 2 minutes and 12 seconds after launch, those solid rocket boosters, those side SRBs, will then separate or jettison from the main core stage of the rocket. From that point on, we'll have the main core booster continuing. At 3 minutes and 16 seconds, the very top of the rocket is actually a launch abort motor. If there's an issue, it can carry the crew away. That will abort just after 3 minutes, and the fairings that protect the spacecraft will also jettison. So now Orion is open to the vacuum of space. The core booster will continue to travel through outer space. At about 8 minutes and 3 seconds, the 4 main engines on that core stage will then shut off. And then shortly after, 8 minutes and 15 seconds into flight, that is when the second stage will depart and Orion will begin its journey to the surface of the moon. It really was truly a remarkable thing. It was a decade in the making. And finally, a big sigh of relief for everybody here, not only because the rocket is no longer on the launch pad, but it really did a very good job of getting the Orion space capsule on its way to the moon. It'll probably be there in the next couple of days. Here's a recap of last night's launch if you happen to miss it. Excitement was contagious at the Kennedy Space Center Tuesday night as America's next moonshot took flight, setting the tone to soon put Americans back on the surface of the moon later this decade. Seconds after liftoff, the deafening sound of the 8.8 million pounds of thrust reached the crowd. Orion, the spacecraft, was now headed to the moon.
So you guys know I have talked a lot about appreciating the moment that you're in, and we have worked hard as a team. You guys have worked hard as a team for this moment. This is your moment.
The countdown was not easy. Another hydrogen leak required a team to go to the pad inside the blast danger zone to tighten bolts on a valve. The range, who is in charge of tracking the rocket and preventing it from threatening people if it goes off course, had to replace an Ethernet switch. But at 1:47 a.m. Eastern Time, a little behind schedule, Artemis was headed to the moon in a flawless nighttime launch.
The harder the climb, the better the view. We showed the Space Coast tonight. What a beautiful view it is.
And you just heard the roars of excitement and cheers as Artemis is getting higher and higher from everywhere around here at the Kennedy Space Center. Again, right now the teams are working no issues as Orion is on its way to the moon. Live at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, I'm Weather First meteorologist Nick Stewart, Iowa's News Now.